Hello everyone, welcome to Midway Gaming. I'm Nico inside the comms, of course, Justin, and today we've got one in the world of Nintendo. I lied, I think, maybe.
Perhaps.
Said we might have been doing PlayStation. We are not doing PlayStation, we're doing another of the big four, and that is Nintendo. Well, no, big three, unless you count, I guess. Not big three, unless you count, I guess, I don't know, Steam. And even then, it's kind of a crapshoot when it comes to the PlayStation, or
Steam is
PCs.
just kind of there.
Yeah, unless you count Valve, it's kind of a crapshoot when it comes to like the PC world. Um, but yeah, of the big three, we're going with Nintendo this time, and it's going to be a bit of an interesting episode here. Just to kind of give you some quick rundown on what we're doing in terms of topic, right? There's been quite a bit of controversy surrounding the whole Nintendo Switch 2 game card things, chiefly because the fact that they're technically not the game, they're just a license in card form, which then force you to download the full game locally. Which means technically you're not even buying the full game. You're just buying the full game. You're buying the game you're buying the license for the game at the full price of the game, yet still technically not owning it. Which, if
Yes.
that doesn't stink of legal loopholes, I don't know what does. But that's not technically where things are really, you know, concerning. It's more of the fact that because technically it's a license, you can't really preserve anything. Got a whole video, again, going to shout out YongYea, does a much better description going into this topic better than I am. This is not going to strictly be about game card. That is why I'm providing his video directly, because that's all he talks about in that video. It's going to be more kind of the state of Nintendo as it is right now, because jumping off the point of the game cards, we have the fact that in at least the US, the Switch 2 is massively outpacing the Switch 1 in terms of sales, thus far anyway. And that is good for Nintendo for many reasons, many reasons. But despite the fact that the sales are very much up, you also have this article from IGN that's come out, which supposedly, again, from IGN's reporting, based on another YouTuber who did his own reporting, Nintendo themselves is reportedly almost discouraging Switch 2 development as studios told to launch games on Switch 1 and rely on backwards compatibility instead. Which is weird, right? Again, you'd think because the game cartridges, they'd be able to legally loophole their way around possibly saving money. Maybe, I don't know. And then you have the fact that, sales are pacing up for the Switch 2. Great, all things are good. But yet you have Nintendo also telling people, yeah, don't develop things for the Switch 2. Develop things for the Switch 1 and just backwards compatibility themselves back. It feels almost like a reverse of what's happening,
Double
or what
meaning
happened
type
with COVID.
going on.
Yeah, almost like a double meaning, yeah. You'd think that they'd be happy that Switch 2 and they'd be trying to encourage as much Switch 2 development as possible, right? But again, according to internal reporting, they're not. They're doing the opposite, almost at least. So it feels weird, right? Again, it feels almost like what we got in terms of COVID, except reverse, right? COVID happened as a COVID pushed backwards compatibility far more because of kind of the state of the environment, right? We had the chip shortages that came from social distancing, which forced factories to shut down, which caused the chip shortages. We had the fact that because of the fact that chips were shorted, there weren't as many consoles on the market, which forced the consoles that were already on the market to be very short supply, which allowed scalpers to just scoop them all up, which means nobody could really get a hold of the new stuff. So put that all together, it results in an environment where everyone has to still rely on the older hardware, despite the fact that they want to have the new hardware. So backwards compatibility became much more of a necessary evil, so to speak, on terms of the game companies. In this case, though, it feels like Nintendo's kind of forcing this themselves. So it's weird, right? So let's just kind of dive into the specifics, right? And again, let's kind of go with that whole business with the game card and start there, right? YongYea reported, based on whatever people else are saying, that because the fact the game cards are technically not the game, well, they're not the games themselves, there's no technically here, you're literally just buying the game's license at the full price of the game, you're not technically owning physical media. You're just owning the rights, not even the rights you could argue, to download that media, which technically also circumvents Japanese preservation laws. Because, fun fact,
Yes.
there's actually a corporation that he talks about in Japan that literally,
Works on preservation.
yeah, that works on preservation. And since, like, I think they said the 2000s ish, they've been trying to preserve all games that have been released locally, if they can. So, yeah, they've got like an archive of, I believe it's 9,000 games or something like that. And it's impressive, don't get me wrong, especially considering the fact that companies certainly don't seem to be interested in preservation games, unless you count, I guess, GOG's efforts. Most companies are just content to leave it out in the wild and just if it lives, it lives, if it dies, it dies kind of thing. So yeah, it's kind of good to see that. The problem lies again with the fact that since game cards aren't physical media, they're just, licenses in a box effectively. They don't count as physical media, which means they don't constitute being preserved, which means if you do a bit of, extrapolation here, if that game ever ceases to be accessible via the servers, so let's say Nintendo just shuts down their Switch servers or something,
That's
that
it.
game's gone. Yeah,
That's it.
it's gone. That's gone. So it's causing a bit of controversy, especially considering the fact that, again, ever since the aforementioned, I think we can still say COVID on YouTube. I said it anyway. It
You're
doesn't matter.
fine. Yeah, you're fine.
It doesn't matter at this point. I said it already once. Ever since that whole business, people have been far more interested in game preservation and backwards compatibility. It's become a far more of a bigger selling point than it ever has been, especially because of COVID. I guess every dark cloud has their silver lining, they say. And so, in those backwards compatibility spaces, it's become a pretty big touching point as far as the game cards are concerned. Because, like I said, you don't technically own anything here. You just own what is effectively a license in a box, full price, no less. So yeah, scummy business decisions and all that just don't rub well for anybody, especially because it makes, like I said, preservation almost impossible in that regard. So you'd think Nintendo would be in a backroom scheming, going, "We got 'em, boys, we got 'em, toast all around." And on the surface, again, it does seem like that, because then we move on to our second article, and we're going to talk about in more detail, and that is that Switch 2's sales are massively at the moment outpacing Switch 1's in the US. Again, unsurprising considering most new gen consoles generally tend to outpace their competitor, their previous ones. Eventually, I'd like to think. Specifically, in this article, we have, quote, unsurprisingly, the Switch 2 helped propel total US gaming hardware sales in July of this year, mind you, which surged from 21% from 33. My tongue doesn't work, excuse me. 317 million in July 2024 to 384 million in July 2025. So, that's a quite a few millions increase. The Switch 2 was the only major console platform that posted growth in July 2025 in the US, with PS5 sales dropping by 47%, interestingly enough. Xbox Series, again, I'm always unaware how to say their name, Xbox Series X and S, I'm going to screw that up one day, sales sliding by 69%. Shocking. That is more than half their sales sliding off between the 2 years, which is interesting.
I mean, to be fair on the Xbox front, however, they are majorly pushing away from like selling the console and just kind of sharing overall type of thing. So there's that.
True. That is kind of a topic we could have for another video, ladies and gentlemen, where it's kind of the idea where Xbox, especially I've seen, like, even when I was all the way in the UK, I could still feel the Xbox's idea of, we're not doing the console sales anymore. We're just, trying to be everywhere. They're trying to make themselves a more ubiquitous brand, I think is the proper word for it, where they're not just tied to consoles. I mean, even Phil Spencer, the big boss of Xbox himself, like, I think at the beginning of the series generation, literally said something along the lines of, he doesn't believe in the console wars or something like that anymore. He's kind of thrown his hat away. I mean, Xbox is certainly playing more nice with the other consoles and is certainly being far more ubiquitous with where you can find their stuff, which,
There's that.
back to Nintendo, we know they will never do, so that's something. So it kind of, again, as Justin mentions, does make sense. They're not, pushing as hard. And the original Switch, continuing on the article, spending declining by 52%. So more than just over half of the spending. Again, that makes more sense because Switch 2 came out. The Switch 2 was July 2025's best-selling console in the US. Not surprising, because I think that's when it came out. Actually, no. It came out in June, I think? Yeah, June. My mistake. Best-selling console in the US and top-performing system so far in 2025 overall. PS5 was number 2, unsurprisingly, for 2025 and year-to-date. So again, yeah, it's showing that the sales are massively increasing for Switch 2. Again, as we've mentioned many times through this episode, not surprising because, again, it just came out. And generally consoles like to push, or companies, excuse me, like to push towards the new hardware over the other hardware. You would think. But this is actually where I can segment into our third article of the day, which kind of gives you the exact opposite statement. And I'm just going to, again, read the headline here and just let it do the talking before I elaborate. Nintendo reportedly almost discouraging Switch 2 development as studios told to launch games on Switch 1 and rely on backwards compatibility instead. So there you have it. We have almost mixed signals going on here, right? You'd think because of the Switch 2 outpacing the Switch 1 in terms of sales, which makes sense, that they'd be pushing more for the Switch 2, but it almost feels like they're not. Fun fact, actually, here is on a side note here. Switch 2 actually was, as far as its backwards compatibility was talking about, a major kind of touch point in the past because a lot of companies, or a lot of game makers, I should say, were actually kind of concerned back in the day. I've tried to pull up this article before and I've kind of failed. We'll see if I can get it up for this video. If I can, I can. If I can, I can. But pretty much it was this idea that a lot of game companies were concerned that if Switch 2 had backwards compatibility because of the cadre of games on the Switch 1, there would just be no way for them to sell Switch 2 games. And this is kind of a tale as old as time, right? It's one of the reasons why backwards compatibility was never really a big thing for many generations in the gaming space. Because of the massive amount of games on your old hardware, what's the real incentive to buy, the new hardware unless you're, I guess, a graphics, nut or something like that. So a lot of the game companies went to Nintendo and said, please don't make it backwards compatible because we won't sell the dang thing. So this is something Nintendo took into a lot of consideration going into the Switch 2. Eventually, they did confirm that it will have backwards compatibility, which it does. With on an almost point-by-point basis, I mean, a lot of games are backwards compatible. Weirdly enough, way more third parties than their own, if memory serves, which is kind of weird. But it does have backwards compatibility if the developers opt into it, basically. And we did a whole video talking about the backwards compatibility bit of Nintendo way back in the past, talking about Nintendo Switch 2 Wii. This would be the point where I would point to something in our top right corner that would be leading to that video, but we don't have that feature set up yet, so you're just gonna have to
I
find
think
it.
we
Sorry about that.
do. We probably
Do
do.
we?
We
Do we?
probably
Do that
do,
then.
but that would be hard.
Editor.
No.
Editor, take note.
No.
You're fired. All right.
Reduced to atoms.
You're fired. You get negative pay now.
Negative quota.
Negative quota. You don't get no pay. You get negative pay. You owe me money now.
Right.
But yeah, so again, we talked about that in the past in our previous video talking about the Nintendo Switch 2 and our impressions of it in terms of hardware back when I first bought it. Still have it, but again, going back to the topic of today, right? The fact that Nintendo is telling developers to basically rely on basically backwards compatibility instead of developing for Switch 2 is weird. Specifically, the article states that according to Games Foundry, Nintendo is still restricting its supply of Switch 2 development hardware and instead telling some studios to launch their titles as Switch 1 games that can then be played via backwards compatibility. This has sparked frustration among a number of developers, including at least one AAA studio unable to launch a Switch 2 native version of their game, while hardware is given to some indie creators, including the team behind a Campfire Simulator. Wrong naming. So yeah, there we kind of have it. It's more that they're restricting dev kits, which if you're not fully aware of how dev works, companies provide hardware for their newest creations, and this basically is a dev package which includes kind of the hardware itself and allows creators to kind of work on that hardware and make sure their game works up to snuff, right? Because if you don't know, and again, I'm probably going to butcher some of this because I don't really work in this space, but this is just what I'm aware of, so if I am wrong, feel free to correct in the comment section. But from what I understand, right, the dev kits are basically the local hardware itself for Switch 2. So basically a dev version of the Switch 2 with, I'm guessing, admin access and stuff like that, which allows a individual to actually create their games and make sure it works locally on the game. Because as you know, a lot of games are actually developed locally, even for console, on PC, and then worked on the PS5. It's just better for coding. Nobody's sitting on a PS5 and typing in code on a controller, though I would love to see that. So the dev hardware is basically there so they can make sure that it works properly on the system it's intended to be used for. They code it on a PC and then they make sure it works there and, they tweak it. And basically it's there to trial the game and make sure it works properly on the hardware it's supposed to be meant for. Without that hardware, you just can't do that. I would imagine especially more so with the Nintendo, being that Nintendo is very specific with their hardware.
This is ours.
Yeah. So if they restrict dev kits, then you just can't make stuff for that hardware, right?
And to be fair, when it comes to Nintendo, they are not all too supportive Like they support some modding, but they don't support modding to the same degree anybody else does because they particularly
No.
want people to only go to them when it comes to their games.
No. And while I will say when it comes to the modding, that's not a surprise. I mean, if you know the history of Nintendo and the whole Nintendo seal of quality, which I won't get into for time's sake, but just let it be known that Nintendo's always had a pretty combative relationship when it comes to mods compared to something like Xbox, which has always been more friendly towards it, and PlayStation, which seems to be more of a neutral stance, if anything. Nintendo's stance has always been almost combative when it comes to mods. And again, if you know their history, that makes sense. But because of that, things like emulators and stuff like that are especially frowned upon by Nintendo. So, eh. So, like I said, it feels weird that they're giving these mixed signals, especially when Nintendo is basically selling out of the Switch 2s, you can almost say. At least in the US, again. This article is based in the US. I'm not sure how the European or Asian markets are working. As far as the Asian markets are concerned, I'm sure they're doing pretty well on home turf, but you never know.
Yeah, 50-50 on that one, really. For all we know, something terrible could be going on and we don't really know just yet.
Japan's head office or Nintendo's head office in Japan is just screaming their heads off right now.
Insert the one scene from SpongeBob in SpongeBob's mind where all the versions of himself are freaking out.
Everything's fine, just zooms in on the head, everything's just screaming.
Come on, baby, give me that name!
Anyways, I'm just going to continue the article a bit here to kind of elaborate here.
Mhm.
There's been a lot of talk about this lately that Nintendo seems to be almost discouraging Nintendo Switch 2 development to some degree. Digital Foundry's John Lenneman, I believe it's pronounced. If I pronounced it wrong, my mistake. Said during the team's most recent podcast, I've spoken with plenty of developers where they were told that their game should just ship it on the Switch 1 and rely on backwards compatibility. There's a lot of developers that are unable to get Switch 2 dev kits, Lenneman says. Lenneman continued. We talked to a lot of devs at Gamescom this year, and so many of them said the same thing. They want to ship on Switch 2, they would love to do Switch 2 versions, they can't get the hardware, and it's really difficult now. One particular frustration has been the lack of transparency from Nintendo on why some studios have been given Switch 2 dev kits, while others have not. IGN has contacted Nintendo for comment. I don't really know what Nintendo's mindset was when these sets of decisions, Digital Foundry's Oliver... My brain is trying to pronounce the name. Excuse me. Macizan, I believe it's pronounced. Excuse me again if I mispronounced it. Said, I don't really understand the strategy because like you said, even now developers are struggling to get systems. And I know that some months ago when we were hearing things through the grapevine and talking to people, there was some weird exclusions with some big developers struggling to get game kits for games. Excuse me, my brain is having issue pronouncing at the moment. So yeah, there you go. It's kind of this weird thing of Nintendo almost prioritizing smaller studios over AAA, which is again a weird decision on their behalf. So yeah, it just kind of gives you mixed signals all around. And yeah, it's kind of the weird state we're in with Nintendo at the moment. I don't really know where to kind of go here because, again, it's hard to really make inferences with Nintendo, right? We were talking before the show, and Justin gave the theory, crackpot as it may be, that it almost seems that Nintendo has two separate states here, right? One that is almost happy about Switch 2, and the other that seems, hesitant about developing on Switch 2.
Well, I don't know if it's hesitant. I wouldn't say hesitant. I would say more along the lines of I feel like there is a side that just, is business as usual and wants to go and make profit. And then another side that realizes, hey, some of the stuff that we're doing might not be so good in the long run, especially in like terms of preservation and all that type of stuff. So they're probably maybe trying to help people out by going and subtly saying, hey, maybe don't get the Switch 2. Because at the end of the day, the one fact of the matter is true is that they haven't specifically said go for Switch 1 or Switch 2. They haven't said one or the other.
Yeah, they've certainly been mum about the whole state of where they stand in terms of which one's their favorite. I mean, I could take a guess, but we never know. I myself am kind of hesitant to make that theory because at the end of the day, Nintendo has always been the company to do whatever the heck they want, regardless of how things stand. And backwards compatibility, if you want to make that discussion, has always been, again, going back to my previous point about Nintendo's, what they were going to do with Switch 2 and backwards compatibility. A lot of people were thinking they weren't because Nintendo was actually the company that never really cared too much about backwards compatibility to begin with. In fact, they were, I think, the last people to actually start caring. So, I mean, Wii ports back in the day, but even then, right, you could argue that was just cashing in. You know, backwards compatibility has never really been a thing for Nintendo. So the fact that they're starting to encourage it now is again weird,
Mhm.
and it just makes you wonder what the decision-making process is at the moment and
I
what they're
mean,
trying to
to be
achieve with all of
fair, there
this.
has been some backwards compatibility in the past for some Nintendo games, specifically in the handheld when it came to the DS.
True.
But
I mean,
that was
then again,
very
the hardware's all
specific.
the
Yeah,
same.
yeah, and that's the other thing. That was very specific, and the hardware was the same when it came to the cartridges.
So it might be more of a coincidence than an intention.
Yeah, in that case, I
That's
think
always nice.
it is believable to be a coincidence. But in this case, it's like it's up in the air now because, for all we know, it really does seem like they're trying to do preservation.
I would say preservation because, like I said, it's hard to say where
Yeah,
Nintendo stands on these things.
yeah.
Nintendo has always been pretty mum behind closed doors, so I don't know. Like I said, it's
It's
just one
up
of
in
those
the
weird things.
air, and they're obviously pushing for backwards compatibility and all that. So,
At least on some level. So
um,
yeah, just thought we'd bring that all to your attention. It's a weird thing to talk about with Nintendo because again, we have this massive conversation going on about game cards being just basically the bane of backwards compatibility as far as Nintendo's concerned. And then you have the whole Switch 2 side of things, the actual hardware is selling like hotcakes in the US, yet on the corporate side, Nintendo seems to be almost hesitant to let the hardware get too prolific in terms of development. So it's weird, right? Again, as we talked about in the article, even a AAA studio, which I don't think was mentioned, might have been the one that I was talking about earlier, but I don't think so, hasn't themselves even been able to get it. So a AAA dev not even being able to get it is weird, right? They're the ones you'd think with the most influence. So the fact they can't get it is, again, weird on their part. It might just have been a clerical error from Nintendo, but you never know. Again, apparently, according to Gamescom, a lot of devs are expressing the same logic, so, who knows? Like I said, it's a nice, interesting point to bring to your attention. So let me
mhm.
know in the comments. What do you guys think? Do you think Nintendo's being screwy here? You think they got a grand plan? Do you think this is a clerical error? What do you think is Nintendo's mindset? Because frankly, I'm curious to see what the overall consensus is. Because Lord knows I don't. So yeah, that's the video. That's our comments, and hope you all enjoyed. See you all next week, and yeah, we'll see what the schedule holds. Maybe we'll talk about something happy, sad. I don't know. Any final comments, Justin?
No, I don't have any final comments.
All right, then we'll sign it off. 20, almost 23 minutes. Oh, not really 23 minutes. All right, I think that's a good number. So, bye bye. Have a good night and see you all next week. Bye bye, everybody.
Have a good day.